Now, the M4 Mac Mini is probably one of the best PCs that you can get from Apple. It's extremely versatile, very compact, and powerful enough for most people's day-to-day needs. But now we have the Mac Studio, which is powered by the new M4 Max chip. Now, the baseline configuration of the Mac Studio, which is what we have right now, starts around $2,000. You get a 14-core CPU, a 32-core GPU, 36 gigabytes of RAM, and 512 gigabytes of SSD storage. The Mac Mini M4 baseline configuration, which is what we have over here, is about $600 from Apple, but on sale on Amazon for under $530. So that means the Studio is almost 4 times the price of the M4 Mac Mini. But do you actually get 4 times the performance? Well, we're going to take a look at exactly if that is the case. We're going to be taking a look at the CPU, GPU, SSD performance, take a look at video encoding, rendering, MO capabilities, as well as the gaming performance of both these two machines to determine which one is best, which one has the best bang for buck, and right for you. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the overall size difference of the Mini versus the Studio. The Mini is ultra compact. It only has a footprint of around 12.7 centimeters by 12.7 centimeters and has a height of 5 centimeters, and it only weighs about 670 grams. The Studio is not that much larger, but is definitely a lot more hefty compared to the Mini. It has a footprint of 19.7 centimeters by 19.7 centimeters, has a height of about 9.5 centimeters, and weighs about 2.74 kilograms. Now, even though the Studio is about 4.5 times the volume of the Mini, it's still super compact. It can fit in pretty much anybody's workspace environment on any desk, and definitely a lot smaller than most traditional PC towers that you're going to find out there, any custom gaming PCs, and it packs a lot of power in a very compact package. On top of that, the thermal management system on the Mac Studio is a lot more beefier. It has thermal exhaust vents at the back of the unit, and even though the fan is larger, more powerful than what we encounter with the Mini, it's still super quiet. I basically barely heard it during our testing phase, and the temperature management system is also very consistent without any issues of thermal throttling based on my experience. Now, the thermal management system on the Mini is certainly a lot smaller. It exhausts hot air at the bottom portion of the PC, which is not optimal in my opinion, and it can be susceptible to thermal throttling, but I personally haven't encountered that throughout my almost 4.5 months of ownership, and I do a lot of video editing on this thing, but if you're going to be using this 24/7 with high demand workloads, you might have some issues with thermal throttling, which can be a concern from a long-term standpoint, but in terms of overall noise of the fans themselves, it's actually very quiet, very similar noise levels to what I encountered with the Mac Studio. Now, certainly the biggest benefit of the Mac Studio is the better ports and connectivity options. Starting at the front, you're going to notice that we have a full-size SD card reader, as well as 2 USB Type-C connections with data transfer speeds up to 10 gigabits a second. The Mac Mini on the front also has 2 USB-C connections as well as a headphone jack, but it's not until you encounter the back of the Mac Studio where the benefits start coming into place. You have 4 Thunderbolt 5 connections as standard, no matter what version of the Mac Studio you're going to get, versus on the Mac Mini, you're limited to Thunderbolt 4 if you get the baseline M4 chip. If you get the M4 Pro variant, you do get Thunderbolt 5, which is nice to have. The difference between Thunderbolt 5 is about 120 gigabits a second in terms of maximum throughput, versus on Thunderbolt 4, you're limited to about 40 gigabytes a second maximum throughput. On top of that, the Mac Studio also has full-size USB 3 Type-A connections, which is super handy to have. They're only limited to about 5 gigabits a second in terms of speed, but very convenient to have nonetheless. You also have full-size HDMI 2.1 port on both PCs, as well as a 3.5 millimeter headphone connection at the back of the Mac Studio. And on the Mac Mini, we have a gigabit Ethernet connection. If you get the baseline configuration, you can upgrade the Mac Mini to get 10 gigabit Ethernet, but that's a optional extra options, versus on the Mac Studio, all of the Mac Studios come with 10 gigabit Ethernet as standard. Now, if you want to hook up a multi-monitor setup with the Mac Mini or the Studio, there are a number of different configurations to choose from. Obviously, on the Mac Studio, you can have a more high-resolution displays at a greater quantity. For example, you can connect up to 4 6K displays, 60 Hz refresh rate over the Thunderbolt 5, in addition to having one connected through HDMI at 4K 144 Hz. So essentially 5 very high resolution monitors connected at the same time. With the M4 Mac Mini, you can connect 2 6K and 1 5K monitors at 60 Hz refresh rate using the Thunderbolt connection, as well as a number of different combinations with Thunderbolt and HDMI. Obviously, you don't have the memory bandwidth for driving a lot of high resolution displays like you have on the Mac Studio with the M4 Max GPU, but still more than adequate enough for most people's triple monitor or even dual monitor configurations. We actually have a dedicated video on how to set up the Mac Mini with multiple different monitors. Now, let's talk about the internal configuration on the cheapest version of the Mac Mini versus the cheapest version of the Mac Studio. Now, the Mini M4 chip comes with a 10-core CPU with 4 performance cores and 6 high-efficiency cores. You also get a 10-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and 256 gigabytes of SSD long-term storage. Now, if you want to option up to the Pro version of the Mac Mini with the M4 Pro chip, with the baseline configuration of that model, you get 12 cores of CPU, 16 GPU cores, 24 gigabytes of RAM, and 500 gigabytes of SSD storage. The Mac Studio that we're testing on is the baseline configuration of the M4 Max chip. That has a 14-core CPU comprised of 10 performance cores and 4 high-efficiency cores. You have a 32-core GPU with hardware-accelerated ray tracing capabilities, 16-core neural engine. We have about 36 gigabytes of RAM, as well as 512 gigabytes of SSD long-term storage. Now, you can configure the Mac Studio to have the M4 Max chip with the 16-core CPU and 40-core GPU, as well as option up to the previous generation M3 Ultra chip, which is actually technically faster if you get the 32-core CPU version with the 80-core GPU, which is the top end spec of the Mac Studio right now. I'm not exactly sure how much faster the M3 Ultra is compared to the upper end of the M4 Max, but certainly if you want the top end version of the Mac Studio with maxed out RAM and storage configuration, you're easily well into the 5-digit figures, specifically with the 32-core and 80-core GPU version of the M3 Ultra with 512 gigabytes of RAM and 16 terabytes of SSD storage. You're looking at over $14,000 to get the top end spec of the Mac Studio. Certainly quite a hefty price tag, considering the fact that this is quite a small and compact machine. Now, considering we have the poor man's version of the Mac Studio, which is under $2,000, let's see how it compares against the poor man's version of the M4 Mac Mini, in addition to the M4 Pro version of the Mac Mini as well on some of our benchmark results. Now, the first thing we're taking a look at is the overall CPU performance of these machines. Now, using Geekbench, which is going to take a look at our single core and multi-core performance on the standard Mac Mini M4 chip, we're getting around 3,800 points on the single core and 15,000 points on the multi-core. The M4 Pro version of the Mac Mini got around 3,600 points single core and just over 20,000 points multi-core, and the M4 Max chip found on the Studio got around 4,000 points single core and 23,000 points multi-core. Next, let's take a look at the Cinebench results. You're looking at 174 points on single core, 973 points multi-core on the standard M4 Mac Mini. On the M4 Pro, we're getting around the same in terms of single core performance, but the multi-core performance is up to 1,400 points. And on the Mac Studio with the M4 Max chip, you're looking around 190 single core and 1800 on the multi-core. Now next, let's take a look at some of our synthetic benchmark results for the GPU, starting with Geekbench Metal, which is going to test out the metal processing capabilities of the GPU. And on the base M4 chip, we're getting around 57,000 points. On the M4 Pro variant, we're getting around 100,000 points, and the M4 Max is around 155,000 points. So certainly quite a significant difference coming from the base M4 chip all the way to the M4 Max. Well, how does that data translate into real-world GPU gaming performance? Well, using Unigen's Valley benchmark at ultra-detailed settings, we got around average frames per second at around 21 frames per second on the M4 chip, about 37 average frames per second on the M4 Pro, and the M4 Max got around 68 average frames per second in the exact same scenario. So you're getting more than 3 times the performance coming from the M4 going to the M4 Max. We're actually going to be doing a dedicated gaming comparison between these two, testing out a whole bunch of different native macOS games, as well as many games using crossover translation tools, so we can play some of our favorite PC games on the Mac. So if you're interested in gaming with these two machines, definitely check out that video if you haven't done so already. But let's move on to the SSD performance. Now, certainly one of the big drawbacks of getting the cheapest variant of the Mac Mini is that you only get a 256GB SSD, and it's also not as fast as the higher end SSDs from Apple. So for example, using Amorphous Disk Mark, we only got around 3,000 megabytes a second in terms of read, and about 2,000 megabytes a second in terms of write. That's about half the speed as you're going to get with the higher capacity. So even with the 500 gigabyte version SSD that we have on the Mac Studio, you're getting over 5,900 megabytes a second in terms of sequential read speeds and about 4,000 megabytes a second in terms of write. That's definitely a significant difference, something that you are going to perceive in reality when you transfer large files from an external SSD into your internal SSD. So I would definitely recommend at least getting the 500 gigabyte SSD drive if you're going to get the baseline configuration of the Mac Mini. Now, if you're going to be using these machines as AI development tools for machine learning systems, there are some synthetic benchmarks that we can kind of compare these two with. Geekbench has a new suite with their ML processing that'll give you of how accurate the CPU, GPU, and neural engine is in terms of quantifying large data sets at 32-bit, medium data sets at 16 bits, and quantized data at 8-bit. So Geekbench is going to give us a score on how each CPU, GPU, and neural engine handles a specific data set, and the larger the score, the greater the level of accuracy. So you could definitely see that compared to the M4 chip, the M4 Max ML capabilities are certainly a lot more accurate, more reliable as well in terms of its CPU, and mostly its GPU performance is significantly better. You can see that the neural engine ML capabilities are pretty much the same across the board, but it's really the GPU where you find that significant difference. So if you're going to be developing with different AI tools, certainly the Mac Studio has an advantage there. Lastly, let's talk about something that I do on a daily basis, which is video encoding and rendering. Now, we're going to take a look at its render output times on both Final Cut Pro, Premiere Pro, as well as its video encoding capabilities on Handbrake. Let's start with the Premiere Pro performance. We basically have a 4K 30 FPS timeline at 20 minutes total length, and we're going to render out to H.264 for YouTube distribution, and the time it took to export that file is about 10 minutes 6 seconds on the standard Mac Mini with the M4 chip, and on the M4 Max chip on the Mac Studio, we got in the exact same scenario about half the time, 5 minutes 44 seconds on Premiere Pro. So basically, in terms of real time, the Mac Mini rendered out that 20-minute file about half the time, and it took about a quarter of the time on the Mac Studio. Moving on, let's talk about Final Cut Pro. Using the pretty much exact same 20-minute sequence, we exported in H.264, 4K 30 FPS, and it was a little bit faster on the Final Cut Pro since it's better optimized for the chip, but not by a significant margin. On the M4 Mac Mini, the same exact video project took about 9 minutes and 59 seconds to export versus 5 minutes 52 seconds on the Mac Studio. Last but not least, I took some RAW files from my camera, which were recorded 4K 60 FPS H.265, and I basically encoded them in Handbrake for easier editing, basically creating proxies. And those 3 files took about 5 minutes 50 seconds to encode and finish on Mac Mini versus about 3 minutes 34 seconds on the Mac Studio. So the basic moral of the story is, if you're a professional video editor or somebody that really values their time and you want the faster render times, you don't want to wait too long, you are going to get at least twice as fast speeds on the baseline configuration of the Mac Studio compared to the cheapest version of the Mac Mini. Now, based on our experience thus far, in terms of the CPU performance, there isn't a major difference between the M4 Max and the M4 Pro or standard M4 chip. We measured average around 60% performance boost on most of our CPU benchmarks, and real world difference between a 10-core CPU and a 14-core CPU is not that big of a deal. But what is a much bigger deal is the fact that we have a much more powerful GPU. We're getting almost 3 times the performance in our synthetic benchmark results, our gaming performance, as well as our video output render times are a lot quicker, almost half the time compared to the standard M4 chip. So if you're a video editor and want to maximize your time and workflow, certainly halving your render output times is definitely a big deal and certainly can be worth 4 times the price depending on your needs. But I think there's basically 2 major benefits that the Mac Studio presents compared to the standard Mac Mini. One is the fact that it has all the ports and connectivity options built into the PC. Now, there's a lot of benefits of the Mac Mini, but certainly one of the drawbacks is the fact that it has limited ports and connectivity options. There's no USB Type-A connections and limited USB Type-C, as well as only Thunderbolt 4 if you get the baseline cheapest version of the Mac Mini. If you want Thunderbolt 5, you have to upgrade to the more higher spec versions of the Mac Mini. And in a lot of cases, if you're going to be using the Mac Mini as your daily driver PC, you're going to need some sort of hubs, adapters, or dock of some kind to get an SD card slot, some USB Type-A connections, and other connectivity options, eliminating the ethos of the Mac Mini, which is a very compact and minimalistic device. And if you have to use all these accessories to get the most out of it, it kind of defeats the purpose. But if you are interested in the must-have accessories of the Mac Mini, we have a dedicated video for that. Now, with that being said, on the Mac Studio, you have plenty of connectivity options, a full-size SD card reader, plenty of USB Type-C connections, including Thunderbolt 5. You have the 2 USB Type-A 3.0 connections, which is definitely handy to have if you have a lot of legacy products, especially a lot of accessories that still use USB Type-A, and it's definitely handy to have. In addition to the fact that you have a 10 gigabit Ethernet connection, which is standard with the Mac Studio, and an upgradable option on the Mac Mini. Another key advantage, although I haven't encountered it, but if you're going to do a lot of heavy-duty workloads all day, if you're going to be using it as a workstation grade PC, there are some thermal limitations with this small, compact design of the Mac Mini. I really haven't encountered much, but I'm not rendering videos 24/7. But if you're a heavy-duty power user that is going to really take advantage of both the CPU and GPU performance of the Mac Studio, due to its better thermal design and output, you're going to be less susceptible to thermal throttling and things like that, which is certainly a factor on the Mac Mini. And lastly, no matter how you spec the Mac Studio, even if you get the cheapest variant, which we have over here, the M4 Max is going to be faster than any version of the Mac Mini, even the one powered by the M4 Pro chip, as we demonstrated in our benchmark. So certainly you have more storage upgradable options, obviously not aftermarket, but when you initially buy your Mac Studio, you can really option a lot of memory, a lot of system resources straight from Apple, although it's definitely going to cost you an arm and a leg and a body as well. The upgrade price of the storage as well as RAM on Apple side is absolutely ridiculous. And it's kind of the same case with the Mac Mini. But the cool thing about the Mac Mini is it does have user accessible SSD drive. Now you have to get a specialized SSD, but we're going to actually be bringing out a video on how you can upgrade your 256 gigabyte SSD to a 1 terabyte for half the price of what Apple charges you for. It's a fairly simple process, so definitely make sure to click on the description down below for that video. But regardless of anything, if it had to come down to picking one over the other, for me personally, I think the value proposition of the M4 Mac Mini is still unbeatable, especially at this price point. I'm sure eventually you can get this thing for under $500. It's going to be very tough to make any PC, let alone this size, at that price point with the versatility factor and ease of use that this thing has to bring. And it's really unmatched, heads and shoulders beyond any of the competition, including the Mac Studio from a pure value proposition. But obviously there's a place for the Mac Studio if you want the better ports and connectivity options, the more powerful internal capabilities, potentially future-proofing yourself a little bit more. This is definitely a very viable option for professionals or people that want to get the most out of their desktop PC. But really on that, guys, that's really it. I definitely have to know what you guys think of the Mac Studio. Do you think it's worth it over the Mac Mini? If you had to pick between the two, which one would you get? If you haven't done so already, please make sure you have liked, subscribed, and have post notifications turned on. And we want to thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks for your support, and we'll see you real soon in the next one. Take care.